Hi, my name's Anna Mauser. I'm Programme Lead this year for Systems Changes in the South East, and I'm a member of the Point People. Today I'm going to talk about how to find the flex in your system. In order to find the flex in your system, you first need to be able to explore your system, to be able to understand it better, to see where there's potential for change. Where is there wiggle room? Where is that little opportunity of something that could be different? And as part of the Systems Changes programme, the first half of our programme is devoted to exploring your system, to noticing things that are around you. The second half then is about using that knowledge and starting to experiment with change where it's possible. And in order to experiment with change, finding the flex is absolutely vital. But it can be really, really hard to see where there's flex in your system. Often we come up against statements like, "This is how things are done around here. These are the rules. I can't do this." Or, "We've tried it before, it didn't work." These are pretty familiar statements to anybody working in public services. But generally, there's always reasons why people don't want things to change, and there's always reasons why people want things to seem quite fixed. But are things really fixed? Because someone says this is the rules or this is how it's done around here, does it have to be? And this presentation is all about teaching you and supporting you in how to kind of question those things around you. An example would be a new house. When we move to somewhere new, we're immediately looking for what we can change, what we can make our own. How do we make somewhere feel like home? You walk into a house and you form an impression. You think, "Oh, I'll change the paint on that wall, or I'll strip out that wallpaper. Maybe I'll put my pictures up, I'll take out all this awful furniture." Maybe you could even imagine knocking through a couple of walls or extending out the back. If, like me, you rent your property, you'll be thinking, what am I allowed to change here? Is this kind of actually quite fixed? Or do you think they'll let me put a new paint thing up here or stick my posters up? But it's not always easy to notice the things that you can change. You have to have quite an expert eye sometimes and almost be in the right mindset to see the potential of a place. And sometimes it's a lot easier just to go, "Do you know what? No, I just can't see it. It's too much. There's too much change required here." And often that can be what happens when you look at doing work to change a system or to change an organisation and improve things. Things are so complex, there's so much going on that sometimes it's easy to kind of step back and go, "No, just too much. We need to start from scratch." But actually, change doesn't tend to start from a blank page very often. It's built layer on layer over time, and if you look at the example of this building, someone's dug right back down to the foundations, but they've left the foundations in place and they've done a transformation, but it's still built upon something that preceded it. We can't ever quite get rid of that foundation, that structure that we're building upon. But it's about thinking within this organisation, within myself even, what are the things that I can start to change? What are the things that maybe I haven't noticed today, but which there is some flex around? An analogy that we use on the programme for this is dark matter. Dark matter in the universe makes up about 83% of everything that's out there, of all matter, yet it's completely invisible. And only recently were we able to prove that it even existed or to start to see it in very, very advanced telescopes. And within systems, it's not that we can't see things. There are not truly invisible things in the same way as dark matter. But there are things we stop noticing. The rules, the processes, how things have come into place over time, how people decided to do some things and not other things. And it's this kind of stuff that we need to start to get into if we want to find the flex in a system. An example is, for instance, cities. Cities grow layer upon layer over time. They don't suddenly come down pre-planned and sort of smack bang onto land. It's very much an evolution. But when you look to change a city, it can be quite difficult. For instance, if you've got a big road running through it, it's very hard to remove that road. People are used to being able to get from A to B. Services, communities, all emerge around some of that big road, that infrastructure. So when we're looking at change, we're looking at something that we have to layer. So Dan Hill, when he talked about cities, said how a city is to some extent a product of the council's culture and behaviour, the legislation, the operational modes, its previous history and future strategy. So the ability for the community to make their own decisions can be inhibited by this, but it can also be supported by this. By understanding all these factors and layers that play into what the system is, what the city is we have right now, you can then start to think about making changes. And so going back to kind of frontline work, public services, what's the equivalent of a road that you might be dealing with? Maybe it's some of the rules, the processes, official systems for doing things, boxes you have to tick, things you have to report against. I'm just going to go now and dive deeper into some of the main categories of kind of what we might term dark matter, or put more simply, what are the different types of structures that might be in play in your system, and how might you start to question those in order to find flex? So right at the top of the pile is the law. So with the law, you have to do it. You might be punished if you don't do it. So where's the flex in this? Well, all law is subject to guidance and often interpretation. It can be debated, it can be challenged, and the law itself can ultimately be changed by Parliament, or sometimes even just by a tiny amendment that can be sneaked in through the radar. Now, I'm not wishing to suggest that it's easy to change the law, just that it is something that can be changed. But I think the more important point is that within every piece of legislation, within every piece of law, there's the letter of the law. So there's the things that are actually, you really do have to do them. And then there's a lot of interpretation and imagined stuff that comes with that. So an example that I worked on was the Criminal Records Bureau system. I worked with a lot of voluntary sector organisations who found doing criminal records checks really burdensome. They were checking everybody that came through the door, blanket checks. When I actually went and looked at the law and the legislation, the letter of the law, that wasn't required at all. You were only required to check people if they were in regular contact with your clients, vulnerable clients, and if they were unsupervised. So it's a classic thing here that in putting in place law, in interpreting it, people have overdone it. They've over-egged it. And when you go back, you can actually say, well, we don't really need to be doing this. So something that was actually creating a real problem could be solved by questioning, why are we doing this? Let's look back a bit. Let's take it a step back and look at the reasons and what the law actually is. Next down from law is policy. So this might be big government strategy documents, council strategies, the kind of things that get worked over, have a lot of political weight behind them. And often policies are very powerful and they lead to things being measured. So a lot of performance targets come from policies and political priorities. You might get judged quite severely or challenged if you don't follow policy. So where's the flex? Well, every time you implement a policy, it does represent a choice somewhere in your organisational system. To take an example, the NHS. So there's a big document in the NHS right now called the 5-Year Forward View. It's not a legal document, it doesn't have a legal basis, but it carries huge weight. Many of the conditions which have targets against them, for instance cancer treatment, priorities come from this forward view and waiting times, etc., etc. The interesting thing is that somewhere along the line hospitals are making a choice to conform with the policy. They don't strictly have to according to the law. So where is the flex in that situation? Equally, a lot of the medicines we use in our NHS are recommended by a body called NICE, and they issue guidance as to what should be available to people. Again, it's guidance, it's not law, but it can be very hard to actually not follow policy. So I'm not suggesting here that you tear up your rule books, that you kind of break the law, just that you question when you're finding something in your system that you're working with that's difficult or that maybe you think does need to change. Go back and look where that has come from. Just question it. See whether it really is as fixed as you think it could be, or whether there is wiggle room for change. The next one I'm going to talk about is contract, and this is really, really important in frontline services right now. So what you have to do to keep your word and to be paid for the work that you do. And here, in terms of where's the flex, what are the actual terms of your contract? What's in it and what isn't? Often, again, people can imagine that they have to use a particular form, that they have to see people 3 times a week, that they have to do X, Y, Z. But actually, when you go back and look at the contract, is it actually in there or not? And what's the spirit of your agreement? What did you agree was the actual purpose of the service you were delivering? Because sometimes, and there is real flex with contracts, you can renegotiate. And at that point, the rationale for renegotiating might be that you're actually not doing the thing that you hoped you were doing. You're delivering according to maybe the rules, but you're not getting the aim you hoped for. And that can be a good basis if you do need to actually have a discussion about what it is you're doing. An interesting example that brings contracts to life is how we shop. So if you see a soil association or a fair trade logo in a shop, you're actually buying into a particular form of contract there. So you know that workers have been paid a certain amount of money if it's fair trade, or that for soil association that certain ecological standards will have been met. That means that the people who produce those products have quite a lot of rules and processes they have to keep to. And there's a reason for it. It's so that you know what you've got meets a certain set of criteria. If you buy supermarket own produce, there's a lot more flex for that company to decide how they bring that product to market, whether it's apples, potatoes, baked beans. They've got a lot more choice. They still have to fulfil the law, they have to make sure that they don't do anything illegal, but in terms of how they deliver that, they have a lot more freedom. So looking again at your system and your organisation, how does that play out for you? Where do you have that wiggle room? Where do you have that freedom? And where are you truly constrained? Finally, process. So process is the way of doing things, and often this is where organisations, individuals can get really stuck. So how you put the law into practice. So organisations develop huge systems for making things happen in practice. And they can seem very, very immovable. So in terms of finding the flex here, you might have an office manager who says, we cannot put blue tack up on the walls, we cannot do that, it's against health and safety. And they really feel strongly about that. So how do you challenge that sort of thing? It's not easy. But other examples might be filing systems, a particular computer system. There's no law telling you have to use this terrible computer system, but somebody's paid for it somewhere down the line, so you're all stuck using it. So process can be a really good place to start when you're looking at actually what do we have the power to change. It's not necessarily easy to change, but some of these things, how you can go as simple as how is our office laid out? And it may have been laid out the same for 20 years. Could you move the desks around? How do we run our meetings? Do we all sit in a very formal setting? Could you do that differently? So these are the kind of things that you can start thinking about when you're trying to make change. And often processes find themselves actually becoming a bit out of date. So everybody abides by them, but in some ways they just end up in folders and get in the way. So it's worth questioning what really needs to be there, what's working for us and what isn't. So in order to find your flex in your system, I would encourage you to explore with what's standing in the way of the work that you do with your clients. What are the things that don't help and assist you in getting good outcomes for the people you work with? And once you've kind of noticed these things that are getting in the way, maybe it's a particularly awful referral form, for instance, just question, where does that come from? So what power do I have over it? Well, I have to use this form. Who says I have to use it? And through doing that, you can start to drill down as to where it's come from. So with a referral form, you might find that your manager agrees you have to use it. So where did that come from? Does it come from the contract? Who knows about the contract? Can you go and read that contract in detail? Or does some of it come from the law? And once you start to understand where a process, a rule or a structure has come from, you can then start to question whether you really do need to do it that way. Can you adapt it? Can you shift it? And once you start to do that, that's when you start to find your flex, and that's when you can start to experiment with change and create impact and a ripple effect that can really make a difference.